What if I told you that this 3,000-year-old document holds the key to one of the greatest mysteries in all the Bible, where God parted the Red Sea? And it's not where you think it is. Most people locate the Exodus miracle either at the Gulf of Suez or the Gulf of Aqaba. But the true location is actually somewhere else. And the reason so many have missed it is because it no longer exists. In this video, I'm going to show you the compelling evidence for the sea crossing at the immense, ancient, but now extinct Egyptian border lakes, and how the Bible and archaeology both point directly to this conclusion. Let's go. First, we have to deal with one of the most critical issues at stake, the Hebrew name for the body of water the Israelites crossed through, Yam Suph, which is normally translated as Red Sea. But Yam Suph doesn't actually mean Red Sea, but Reed Sea. In Hebrew, Yam means a large body of water and Suph means reed. We know that Suph means reed because earlier in Exodus, Moses' mother hides him among the Suph, or reeds, of the Nile River. Indeed, if there was one plant which defined ancient Egypt, it was the reed, which filled its rivers, canals, and lakes, and today is still found across the Nile Delta. In ancient Egypt, reeds were vital for daily life and were used for all sorts of basic goods, including papyrus, baskets, and sandals. Crucially, reeds grow in Egypt's calm, shallow inland waters, not the saline open water environment of the Mediterranean or the Red Sea. So why is Yam Suph usually translated as Red Sea? To find out, we need to go back in time. Our maps today are misleading because they showed the Suez Isthmus like this. But 3,500 years ago, things were very different, and the northeastern border of Egypt would have looked much more like this. So what happened? Why did these lakes shrink or disappear? There are three things you must understand. First, for thousands of years, the Nile has been continuously depositing enormous amounts of sediment at its mouth. During the time of the Exodus, the coastline and inland lakes extended much further south than today. But over thousands of years, sediment from the Nile has filled in these lakes, turning them into marshes or dry ground, and pushing the delta out towards the sea. The second thing you must know is that in ancient times, as the Nile flowed north, it broke into dozens of distributaries that spread like a fan across the delta, and the eastern distributaries caused the far eastern delta to be verdant and full of water. However, over time, most of these distributaries have dried up, and today the Nile breaks into just two branches, leaving the eastern rivers, canals, and lakes mostly dry and barren. The third huge factor in this story is the Suez Canal and other drainage projects over the last 150 years that have accelerated the environmental changes to the Suez Isthmus. When the canal was dug in the 1860s, it drained most of what remained of these once great border lakes, leaving little sign of the past. On top of this, in the 20th century, Lake Manzala was mostly drained in an attempt to create new farmland. Today, it is just 1/3 of its size at the beginning of the 20th century. All of this means that our modern maps aren't very helpful in understanding what the eastern border of ancient Egypt was actually like 3,500 years ago, around the time of the Exodus in the 15th century BC. In those days, a chain of lakes spanning hundreds of square miles across covered the Suez Isthmus. These weren't marshes or swamps, but formidable inland seas. And they were not only huge, but deep, at least 20 to 30 feet in many places, which will be important for our discussion later. Together with some ancient canals and the oceans on either side, these lakes formed a long continuous fortification which guarded the Egyptian empire from invaders, a wall of water between Egypt and the deserts to the east. In fact, the desert beyond this wall, the wilderness of Shur, was named after it, as the word Shur means wall. Therefore, because of their proximity and the way they worked together, the distinction between the brackish lakes of the Suez Isthmus and the saltwater oceans on either side was not nearly as clear for the ancient Egyptians as it is for us today. So what does this tell us about Yam Suph? Putting all the evidence together, it becomes clear that the Israelites originally used Yam Suph to refer to the reed-filled lakes on Egypt's border. But since they were so closely linked with the Gulf of Suez, the meaning of Yam Suph expanded over time to incorporate this gulf, and by extension the entire Red Sea, including the Gulf of Aqaba. We actually see this variety of usage in Scripture. For example, after the 8th plague of locusts, God sent a strong west wind, which drove the locusts from Egypt into Yam Suph, one of the eastern border lakes. Then, following the miraculous crossing of Yam Suph, after a week or two of travel, the Israelites once again came to Yam Suph, which almost certainly refers to the Gulf of Suez. Then, much later in the Exodus story, when the Israelites are traveling in the wilderness, they leave Kadesh Barnea and journey into the wilderness in the direction of Yam Suph, traveling around Mount Seir, then turn north and go through Edom. This usage of Yam Suph clearly refers to the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, flash forward to the 3rd century BC. When Jews in Alexandria translated the Torah from Hebrew to Greek, they rendered Yam Suph as Erythra Thalassa, or Red Sea, a name which the Greeks had long used for the body of water dividing Africa from Arabia. It's understandable why they did this, because in the Hebrew Bible, the meaning of Yam Suph often overlaps with the meaning of Red Sea. But it doesn't always overlap. And because of this translation decision, they cut off Yam Suph from its original meaning, the lakes at the border of Egypt. The Hebrew Yam Suph included both the border lakes and the ocean waters, but the Greek Erythra Thalassa only included the ocean waters. Therefore, this choice to render Yam Suph as Red Sea wasn't actually a translation, but more of an interpretation. Although we believe that God's word is inspired by the Holy Spirit, this inspiration doesn't apply to human translations like the Septuagint. So it makes sense that an oversight like this could have happened. By the way, some of you might be wondering, why did the Greeks call it the Red Sea? The origin of the name is unclear, but it might be due to some combination of the red mountains and shores surrounding the sea, which reflect across its waters, the red algae often seen on its surface, or the ancient connection between the color red and the cardinal direction, south. Regardless, the decision by the Septuagint translators to render Yam Suph as Red Sea helps to explain why the Gulf of Suez, the closest part of the Red Sea to ancient Egypt, has been the primary candidate for the Exodus crossing for more than 2,000 years of Jewish and Christian history. The Septuagint's translation of Red Sea was copied by the Vulgate, the early Latin translation of the Bible, and ancient writers like Philo, Josephus, and Eusebius, who also followed the Septuagint. Josephus even added details that aligned with the Gulf of Suez, talking about the mountains that trapped the Israelites in. And early Christians also followed this tradition. In the late 4th century AD, one of the earliest Christian pilgrims, a woman named Egeria from Spain, visited Clysma, a town at the northern tip of the Gulf, and was told by the Christians there that this was the crossing site. Indeed, most Christians in history have maintained the same view, from medieval maps like the Hereford Mappa Mundi, to films like Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 classic, The Ten Commandments. Before critiquing the Gulf of Suez, it's worth mentioning a few good reasons why so many have believed it to be the crossing site. First, some have connected the north part of the Gulf with the Israelites' final campsite before the crossing, which was near Pi Hahiroth, Migdal, and Baal Zephon. Pi Hahiroth means the canal or mouth of the canal, and according to the Greek philosopher Aristotle, one of Egypt's ancient pharaohs had tried unsuccessfully to build a canal from the Gulf of Suez to the Nile. If there was some remnant of a canal at the Gulf of Suez, then it's possible the area near the tip of the Gulf could have been known as Pi Hahiroth. Next is Migdal, which means tower or fortress. Archaeologists have discovered an ancient fortress at the northern end of the Gulf. Although it dates to 200 years after the Exodus, if there was an older fortress at this site, then perhaps this was the Migdal of the crossing story. Finally, we have Baal Zephon, which means Lord of the North. Baal-Zephon was a storm and sea god worshipped as a protector of sailors, and the Baal-Zephon next to the Israelite campground was likely a Baal temple or shrine. Since there was a nearby Egyptian port around the time of the Exodus, it's possible that a temple to Baal-Zephon had been built somewhere nearby for sailors to pray and offer sacrifices before their journeys. In addition to these place names, the geography around the Gulf of Suez seems to fit other details of the crossing story. There are large open areas for the Israelite nation to camp, alongside steep mountains that would have shut them in. Moreover, the eastern side of the Gulf is part of the wilderness of Shur, a large desert where Exodus locates the Israelites after the crossing. Finally, it's worth mentioning that compared to the Gulf of Aqaba, the Gulf of Suez is quite shallow and features gradual seafloor drop-offs. If the waters had parted here, it certainly would not be difficult to walk across. But despite all of this evidence, there's a reason why Christian scholars in the past 50 years have largely abandoned the Gulf of Suez theory. First is the problem with the Yam Suph translation into Greek. As mentioned earlier, this was more of an interpretation than a translation, and it closed off the possibility that the crossing took place across one of the inland seas. Since the lakes of the Suez Isthmus were already shrinking by the 1st century, and since the Septuagint's Red Sea translation was the standard biblical text, it makes sense why the Vulgate and ancient writers would have overlooked these lakes and instead tied the crossing to the Great Southern Ocean they knew much better. Next is the problem of the stops before the crossing. Most scholars are in agreement about the general locations of Sukkoth and Etham, their first 2 stops. Etham is where God told them to turn back, to reverse direction in a way that would cause Pharaoh to think they were trapped and confused, which is why Pharaoh took 600 chariots and quickly reached them. This all makes sense if the Israelites went back in the general direction of Ramesses, north along the inland lakes. Their meandering course of travel made them appear lost and placed them directly east of Ramesses, very close to Pharaoh and his army. But on the Gulf of Suez theory, when the Israelites turned back, they turned south from Etham, which was certainly not back towards their starting point, but still moving away from Egypt. Not the kind of turn that would appear confused to Pharaoh. This turn would also put them even further away from Pharaoh, making him less likely to follow. And there's also issues with the places named right before the crossing: Pi-Hahiroth, Migdol, and Baal-Zephon. The connection between these places and the Gulf of Suez are very thin and lack any support from ancient Egyptian writings. By contrast, these locations fit very well with a different place further north, which will become important soon. But what about the mountains mentioned by Josephus, which are present at the Gulf of Suez, but not along the Isthmus of Suez? Unfortunately, we can't always trust Josephus's retelling of Bible stories, since he often embellished them to suit his Greco-Roman audience. Since he thought the crossing site was the Gulf of Suez, he likely just added details about the mountains nearby to make the story more dramatic. In fact, Josephus actually contradicted himself, because he also said that it took the Israelites 3 days to reach Yam Suph from Ramesses. But the Gulf of Suez is more than 80 miles from Ramesses, a journey of at least 5 or 6 days. And unfortunately, the early Christian traditions also can't be trusted, because they base their Gulf of Suez assumption on the mistaken Septuagint translation. Since Clysma was the most accessible location on the Gulf, a gateway to the Sinai Peninsula, and the center of an early Christian diocese, it was natural to tell early pilgrims that Clysma was the crossing site. But there's no direct evidence that the crossing happened here. But what about the Gulf of Aqaba? Over the past several years, an entire industry has grown around a very new telling of Exodus, which locates the sea crossing at the Gulf of Aqaba and Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia. Hundreds of online videos, films, and books have cropped up selling this story, and there are multiple travel companies taking people right now to see these alleged sites. Unlike the Gulf of Suez, the Gulf of Aqaba theory has almost no solid evidence to support it, and it contradicts the Bible in numerous places. I actually made another video dedicated entirely to the Gulf of Aqaba, and why the crossing could not have happened there. If you're interested in learning more, make sure to check it out after this video. So, if the Gulf of Aqaba and the Gulf of Suez don't match the Exodus story, we must turn to the ancient inland lakes along the Suez Isthmus. The primary objection to the inland lakes is the belief that they were no more than shallow marshes, which would turn the epic sea crossing into just a muddy walk. But this assumes that the landscape today matches the landscape 3,500 years ago, which, as we've already shown, is very mistaken. At the time of the Exodus, the eastern frontier of Egypt was a huge watery moat, home to large lakes with depths of 20 to 30 feet, the height of a 2 to 3 story building. If a body of water like this supernaturally split in two, and if the Israelites walked through its towering walls of water, this was certainly a miracle of biblical proportions. But what about the Hebrew word yam? Given the size of these ancient lakes, is it reasonable to think that Moses would have used yam to describe them, a word typically translated as sea? In modern English, we usually use the word sea to describe a very large body of water. But in ancient Hebrew, yam denoted any body of water from a lake to an ocean. For example, Moses used yam to describe the Sea of Galilee, which is actually much smaller than some of the ancient Egyptian lakes, including the Great Bitter Lake still around today. So the word yam perfectly fits these ancient lakes. And we also know these lakes were filled with reeds, so the word Suph also fits. But is it possible for us to know the exact site of the crossing? I'm about to show you some amazing evidence, an ancient Egyptian manuscript that can answer this very question. Now, in the next part of this video, I'll be relying on the work of James Hoffmeyer and Kenneth Kitchen, who are two of the most prominent Christian Egyptologists in the last 50 years. Let's approach Exodus like a treasure map. Just like a treasure map marks the spot with an X, Exodus gives us the X for the crossing. Right before the Israelites crossed, they were in front of Pi Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal Zephon, by the sea. There's a little-known manuscript at the British Museum called the Anastasi Papyrus, a priestly letter written in hieratic script around 1200 BC, not long after the Exodus. In a key section, Papyrus 3 connects the city of Ramesses, the city from which the Israelites departed, with 3 locations in the eastern delta: Pa Tufi, Pa Kuir, and Mu'in Baal. According to Hoffmeyer, here's what those names mean. Pa Tufi means the marsh or the lake of reeds, and is the Egyptian form of the Hebrew Yam Suph. Pa Kuir means the canal or mouth of the canal, and is the Egyptian form of the Hebrew Pi Hahiroth. And Mu'in Baal means the waters of Baal. Since Baal was a deity from Canaan, not from Egypt, it's very interesting for a place within Egypt to have been named after him. So in light of this, and in light of the nearby Yam Suph and Pi Hahiroth, it's quite likely that the waters of Baal are connected with the Baal Zephon of Exodus. In other words, in the Anastasi Papyrus, a 3,000-year-old document from just after the Exodus, we have, in the space of just a couple lines, 3 of the 4 place names which Exodus itself uses to locate the sea crossing, a geographic cluster which the papyrus uses when describing the eastern Nile Delta. It's hard to think of something closer to a smoking gun than this document. And the evidence doesn't stop here. Other documents offer even more support to locate Yam Suph in the eastern Nile Delta. Consider this. Another ancient record, the Onomasticon of Amenemope, lists more than 100 Egyptian towns from south to north, starting with Biga, then Elephantine Island, and later on Memphis, Heliopolis, Ramesses, and Tanis. The last 2 places on the list are Pa Tufi, or Yam Suph, and then Jaru, the frontier border fortress of ancient Egypt. By placing Yam Suph just before Jaru, this text indicates that Yam Suph is somewhere just to the southwest of Jaru. And since archaeologists have recently discovered Jaru's exact location, we can be certain that Suph was here as well. And on top of this, we even have evidence for Migdol, the fourth place which Exodus ties to the sea crossing. At the Karnak temple in Luxor is a carved relief made not long after the Exodus. It depicts a sequence of forts on the Way of Horus, a military road that went through the northeastern Nile Delta, and shows a canal, possibly Pi-Hahiroth, then Jaru, then another fort, then Migdol. This is actually supported by other parts of the Bible as well. The prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel both list Migdol as the northern boundary marker of Egypt in their day, exactly in line with the Karnak relief. And recent archaeological discoveries in the past 25 years have confirmed that Migdol was indeed located here, just past Jaru, the canal, and Suph. Putting all of this evidence together reveals that the northeastern border of ancient Egypt was home to all four of the sites mentioned in Exodus 14, Pi-Hahiroth, Baal-Zephon, Migdol, and Suph. In modern times, many scholars have laughed at the story of the sea crossing as a funny ancient myth. But the evidence I just showed you confirms that the sea crossing wasn't fiction, but a real account rooted in the real history of ancient Egypt. And it also confirms that the crossing of Suph didn't happen at the Gulf of Aqaba or even the Gulf of Suez, but much closer to ancient Egypt, right on its border at one of the ancient lakes. What's even more exciting is that we can now recreate the exact route the Israelites took from Ramesses to Suph. There were three primary roads leading east from Egypt into Canaan: the way of the land of the Philistines, the way of Shur, and the King's Highway. Exodus says that God did not lead the Israelites down the way of the land of the Philistines, which was heavily fortified with Egyptian garrisons, in case they turned back in fear. Instead, God led them southeast, in the direction of the way of Shur and the King's Highway. As they traveled, the Lord went before them in a pillar of cloud by day, and in a pillar of fire by night, to give them light. From Ramesses, they journeyed 30 miles to a caravan stop called Sukkoth, which means tents or booths. Then they continued east to Etham on the edge of the wilderness, which was somewhere near Lake Timsah. At this point, the Israelites were right on the edge of the desert, about to escape from Egypt. But God had other plans. He told the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-Zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea. Why did God tell the Israelites to turn around just before their escape? He wasn't finished after the 10 plagues. He wanted to show Egypt and the world who was God and who was not. This is what God told Moses. Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, "They are wandering in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh." So Israel turned back and traveled north past Lake Timsah to the edge of Bala Lake. Somewhere on the western side of Bala Lake, they camped, in the midst of Migdol, the sea, the canal, and Baal-Zephon. This makes sense of why Pharaoh knew of the Israelites' whereabouts and exactly where to find them. They were traveling near a bunch of Egyptian forts that were sending information to and from his palace in Ramesses. And it also makes sense of how he was able to reach them quickly with 600 chariots. Chariot wheels were thin and light, and could only move over paved roads or hard-packed earth, not loose sand or mud. The Israelites' campsite was directly east of Ramesses and right next to a major road. So Pharaoh and his men simply went straight east along the road. Given how flat the Nile Delta is, the Israelites would have seen them coming from far off, and they cried out to the Lord and rose up against Moses. But the Lord divided the sea, and the people of Israel walked through to the other side, while the Egyptians drowned as they tried to chase them. Thus Yahweh saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore, and the great power that Yahweh used against the Egyptians. So the people feared Yahweh, and they believed in Yahweh. So, why does this story matter? The God who delivered Israel is the same God who can deliver you and me. This Exodus, as amazing as it was actually pointing to another, even greater Exodus, one that would deliver not just Israel, but the whole world, and not from Egypt, but from the powers of darkness that bind all of us. Many years after this story, a man whose name means Yahweh saves went up on a mountain. This man was Jesus, and on the mountain he was transfigured and talked with Moses. They spoke about Jesus' Exodus, which he was about to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. At the first Passover, the Israelites killed a lamb and spread its blood over the doorposts to be saved from God's judgment. At the final Passover, the Lamb of God, Jesus, was killed, and his blood was shed to save all of us from God's judgment. You see, as brutal as slavery was for the Israelites, both they and us have something much more sinister to deal with: our sin, our separation from God. We are just as much in need of an exodus as they were. So the miraculous story of the sea crossing shows the power of God to deliver. If God delivered his people back then from the wicked rulers of the earth, he can deliver you and me from the dark powers that bind us. Hey, thank you so much for watching this video all the way through. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you have any thoughts or questions, definitely let me know in the comments section below. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It's a huge help to us here at Good News Studios for the making of future content. Take care and God bless.